Good morning, babies. Another chapter of Goblins in the Castle by Bruce Coville. Chapter 6, The Tower Door. Igor, I'm sorry, I whispered. I didn't mean to hurt you. Stupid William, he snarled. You can't hurt Igor. He stepped forward again. I knew I couldn't stop him, but I put my hands up anyway. The gesture was enough to make him pause. He stared at me for a moment, then turned away. When he turned his back, the torchlight reflecting in his eyes showed a pain so deep I knew it had not been caused by my brief gesture. You can't hurt Igor, but don't you never, never, never touch Igor on the hump. Never. He turned away, clumped to the wall, and began pounding on it. One stone actually began to come loose under the force of his blows. Blood covered his knuckles. I ran to him, grabbed his arm. Igor, listen, Igor, I'm sorry. I won't ever do it again, I promise. He kept pounding, shaking me back and forth. For a moment I was afraid I would have my brains dashed out against the dungeon wall. Suddenly he stopped and slumped to the floor, closing his eyes. He dropped his head against the wall. Get bear, he said. Igor want bear. I searched frantically for the bear, finally found it in the pile of rags where Igor slept. When I put it into his hands, he clutched it without opening his eyes. I sat down beside him, no longer afraid. For a long time neither of us said anything. Finally, I decided I should just go. But when I started to stand, Igor opened his eyes. Would you come see Igor, William? Why, well, I was frustrated because I couldn't get solid answers from anyone. I had hoped that Igor might have some information, though. Now that I thought about it, that didn't seem likely, especially given the previous night's conversation. Then I realized the real reason that I had come. I like you, I said. I wanted to talk to you. Igor like William, he replied, giving me an affectionate little bop with his bear. He stared at me for a moment, then asked, Where William come from? I don't know, I replied truthfully. Don't know? He repeated, sounding puzzled. No one seems to know, I said, and then I told him the story of how the Baron had found me on the drawbridge. He looked worried. What's wrong, Igor? Don't know, he said, wrinkling his brow so that his deep-set eyes nearly disappeared. Story make Igor think of something. But what? What? He began to knock his knuckles against his bald head. Think, Igor, he muttered. Think, 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 think. Finally he stood up. Igor hated when he got to think, he said in despair. He sighed. Then he jumped up and said, Igor got to go. Go where? I asked, feeling confused. Got to talk to someone. Who? Can't say. Why not? He looked at me for a moment, then picked up his bear and shook it in my face. See, bear? He asked, as if it was possible for me to miss it. I nodded. Like to get bopped? I shook my head, wondering if he was about to bop me for asking too many questions. But I had misunderstood. He was trying to make a point. Igor don't like to get bopped either. Igor say too much, Igor get bopped. You mean someone will hit you with a bear? I asked, trying to sort this out. He shook his head. Bear Igor's. No one else get to bop with it. But like that. Igor don't want to get in trouble. Igor hate being in trouble. Now, William, go, so Igor can go ask question. Can I go with you? Bad idea, he said so fiercely that I decided not to argue. Annoyed and discouraged, I trudged up the 500 steps. The last thing I wanted was one more secret, One more thing someone wouldn't talk about. I hated it. I went to the great hall on the main floor. Slipping through the metal bars of the cage that rose from the center of the floor, I climbed onto the back of the huge stone toad that gave the castle its name. This was one of my favorite thinking spots. I'd asked Carl a number of times where the caged toad came from, why it was there, what it stood for. He always told me that he didn't know. As I thought about it, I realized that whenever he had told me that, I had believed him, had had no sense that he was holding something back from me. It had been different when he had talked about the North Tower. Then he had seemed to be hiding something, had almost seemed frightened. I had one person left to ask, the Baron. Despite the fact that Carl had warned me not to, I decided to try. The problem was, I had been trained early on to wait until the Baron spoke to me before saying anything, so I had never just gone up to him and asked a question before. I decided if I went where he was, he might speak to me. Then I could ask my question. Despite my curiosity, I felt some reluctance to go to the Baron. Instead of climbing the stairs to the library, I found myself meandering about the great hall, examining with fresh interest things with which I was already quite familiar. The huge chandelier that hung from the middle of the ceiling, the suits of armor that lined the wall, the collection of cannonballs from great battles that rested on the mantelpiece of the enormous fireplace. When I found myself counting the cannonballs for the third time, I decided I had put things off long enough and returned to the stair. I found the Baron at his desk in the library, absorbed in a book. As I waited for him to notice me, I studied his face. It was red and round, as was his nose. His white eyebrows sprouted out in all directions. Along with his bushy mustache, they represented the only hair to be found on his head. Each time he turned a page, he blew through his lips, making a wet, fluttering sound. Suddenly he looked up and noticed me. His eyes were enormous, intelligent, and penetrating. The only truly intimidating things about him, actually, but so ferocious that when he turned them on me, I wanted to sink into the floor. "Hello there, Gerald," he said cheerfully. Then he slammed the book shut and walked away. I clenched my fists, trying to decide whether I was angrier about losing my chance to ask about the tower, or the fact that the Baron couldn't be bothered to remember my name. I looked for another opportunity to ask about the tower at dinner, but Carl was dining with us, and I didn't want to bring it up in front of him. Candles flickered in the candelabras. Spiders worked furiously in the corners. Carl stared at his plate. Hulda bustled silently back and forth. I tossed pieces of hard bread to the rats that scurried along the walls. The only sound was that of the Baron slurping his soup. I went to bed frustrated and angry. A strange thing happened that night. The noises began to change. Before they had always had a sad, far-away quality. Now they were louder, almost impatient. Again I began to think they were trying to say something. And then, so distinctly that there could be no mistaking it, they called my name.